There is a pond on the back 40 of a farm in the Midwest that nobody had waded into on purpose in longer than anyone alive could remember. It sat behind a stand of cottonwoods, past the second gate, in a low spot where the ground had always stayed a little too soft. Cattle avoided the north edge of it out of instinct. Kids were told to stay off the banks, and for almost 70 years it just sat there, doing what stagnant water does, which is mostly nothing until the year a farmer named the pond was finally going to cost him money instead of just being an inconvenience. It started the way most of these stories start, which is to say, it started boring. A calf had gotten stuck in the soft mud along the pond's edge that spring, and it took 3 grown men, a length of chain, and a very unhappy tractor to get it out. That was the second time in 4 years. The vet who came out to check the calf's leg told him plainly that the bank was undercut, that the pond's edge had been eroding for decades, and that sooner or later he was going to lose an animal for good instead of just scaring himself half to death trying to save one. So he made the call that any practical person running a working farm would make. Not a treasure hunt. Not a hunch. A drainage decision. The pond had to come down, at least enough to regrade the banks, shore up the edge, and make sure the next calf that wandered too close didn't end up stuck in a hole nobody could see the bottom of. He rented a trash pump from the equipment place 2 towns over, borrowed a second one from a neighbor, and started making calls to see who around here still knew how to do this kind of work by hand instead of by guesswork. His family thought it was a waste of a summer. His uncle, who had fished that pond as a boy, told him over Sunday dinner that he was messing with something that had been fine for 70 years and would probably be fine for 70 more. His own kids groaned about the smell before a single pump had even been switched on. And the neighbors, the way neighbors do in a small farming community, had opinions. One of them joked that all he was going to pull out of that mud was a rusted transmission and 40 years of frog bones. Somebody else bet him a case of beer he'd hit bedrock before he hit anything worth looking at twice. Nobody was wrong to doubt him. Ponds like this one are common across farm country, dug decades ago for one plain reason or another, and the overwhelming majority of them give up nothing but silt, tires, and the occasional lost fishing lure when they're finally drained. The odds, on paper, were about as unremarkable as odds get. But there was one detail he kept turning over in his head that his uncle's joke hadn't accounted for, a detail that had nothing to do with treasure and everything to do with the pond's actual history, because this particular pond hadn't always been a pond. It had been dug, according to the one photograph that still existed of the property from the early 1950s, on the site of what used to be a much smaller depression in the land, something closer to a low seasonal ditch that only held water after heavy rain. His grandfather had deepened it and dammed one end sometime after buying the property, turning a soggy nuisance into a proper stock pond for watering cattle. Nobody currently living remembered exactly why he'd chosen that spot, or what, if anything, had been on that ground before the water came in. That gap in the family's own memory was the first quiet thread in a story that would take most of a summer to pull all the way through. The morning the first pump went in, the water was the color of strong coffee and gave up nothing to the eye at all. It was just a farm chore. A necessary, unglamorous, slightly dreaded farm chore. The kind that eats a weekend and leaves you smelling like pond scum for a week no matter how many showers you take. Nobody standing at that bank that first morning. Not the farmer, not his uncle, not the neighbor who'd bet him the beer, had the faintest idea that by the time the water was gone, the joke about frog bones was going to look almost embarrassingly wrong. Yeah, draining a pond this size is not a quick job, and it is not a clean one. The first pump, a 2-inch trash pump rated for debris-heavy water, started moving roughly 130 gallons a minute, which sounds like a lot until you do the math on a pond that had been collecting rain, runoff, and groundwater seepage for 7 decades. At that rate, dropping the water level even a single foot across the surface area of this pond was going to take the better part of a full day, running continuously, assuming nothing clogged the intake, which, on a pond bottom full of decades of leaf litter and sediment, was optimistic at best. By the end of the first afternoon, the pump had already choked twice on waterlogged branches and what turned out to be an old fence post that had fallen in sometime in the 1980s. The waterline had dropped maybe 8 inches, progress you could measure with a yardstick nailed to a stake at the bank, and not much more satisfying than that. The smell had already started, that specific sulfur and rot smell of anaerobic mud finally getting exposed to air after decades sealed underwater. A smell that farm kids know instinctively means something buried is finally being allowed to breathe. The second pump went in on day 2, angled toward the deeper southern end where the original dam had been built up. Running both together nearly doubled the rate, but it also doubled the clogging, and by midday the farmer had pulled the intake screens out 3 separate times to clear muck, snail shells, and what he was fairly sure was the skeleton of a snapping turtle that had died of old age rather than misadventure. This was the part of the job nobody glamorizes. It was hot. It stank. The mosquitoes were murderous in the reeds at the pond's edge, and there was absolutely nothing about the first 2 days of work that suggested anything was about to change. By day 3, the water had dropped low enough that the first ring of exposed bank was starting to show, a dark, glistening collar of mud around the shrinking waterline, thick enough in places to swallow a boot to the ankle. This is the stretch of any pond drainage where the work gets genuinely unpleasant, because the mud that has been compacting under still water for generations does not behave like ordinary dirt. It holds suction. Step into it wrong, and it does not just get your boot dirty, it tries to keep the boot, and more than one person working that bank that week left a Wellington behind in the muck entirely, retrieved later with a shovel, and a great deal of cursing. The uncle who'd made the joke about frog bones came back on day 3 to see how the fool's errand was going, and even he admitted, standing at the edge looking at that black exposed collar of mud, that there was something almost hypnotic about watching a pond give up ground it had held for most of a lifetime. He didn't take back the joke, but he stopped saying it quite so loudly. Day 4 brought the first real debris field into view along the drying margins. Not treasure. Just the ordinary sediment of 7 decades of farm life slowly sinking to the bottom of still water. A collapsed section of what had probably been an old wooden dock, soft and gray and furred with algae. A galvanized bucket with the bottom rusted clean through. 2 glass bottles of a style that hadn't been manufactured since sometime in the 1960s, the kind a farmhand might have tossed into deep water rather than carry to a burn barrel. None of it was valuable. All of it was interesting in the specific way that farm archaeology always is. A slow, unintentional catalog of exactly how people lived on this piece of ground across the decades, written in trash instead of records. It was somewhere around day 5, with the water down to roughly a third of its original depth, that the pump operator noticed the intake screen had jammed on something that wasn't a branch, wasn't a rock, and wasn't giving at all when he tried to work it loose by hand. He cut the pump, waded in up to his knees in mud that pulled at every step like it had opinions about him leaving, and got his hands around the edge of something flat and metal, roughly the size of a bread box, wedged at an angle into the silt about 10 feet from where the old dam wall met the original bank. He did not, in that first moment, think treasure. Farm ponds accumulate metal debris the way attics accumulate boxes. He worked it free with more effort than a bread box-sized object should have required, which told him it was heavier than it looked, and heavier than an empty tackle box had any business being. What came up out of the mud was a rectangular metal container, dark with decades of corrosion and silt, its surface pitted and streaked with a specific mineral staining that comes from sitting fully submerged for a very long time. It had a hinged lid and what looked like it had once been a latch, though the latch itself had rusted into a solid, useless lump. There was no label, no visible markings, nothing to immediately identify what it was or how long it had been down there, beyond the simple fact that it had clearly been in that mud for a very long time, long enough for the metal itself to start losing the fight against the water. He set it on the bank rather than try to open it right there. Mud and pond water still running off it in dark rivulets, and for a moment he just stood there, looking at it, the pump idling behind him, the smell of exposed sediment thick in the humid afternoon air. His first instinct, the practical instinct of a working farmer with a chore list a mile long, was to finish the job he'd started and worry about the box later. His second instinct, the one that actually won, was to call his wife down from the house, because whatever this was, it did not feel like something to open alone standing knee-deep in pond muck with nobody else around to see it. That moment, the box sitting on the bank, mud still sheeting off its corroded seams, the pump still running in the background, the rest of the family walking down from the house, not entirely sure why they'd been called, is the moment this story actually turns on. Not the discovery of wealth. Not yet. Land that has been in one family for multiple generations, particularly land that changed hands or was newly developed during the Great Depression or the years immediately following it, has an outsized chance of holding a hidden cache. Bank failures throughout the early 1930s wiped out the savings of millions of people almost overnight. And for a rural landowner watching that happen from a farmhouse instead of a city apartment, burying your savings on your own ground, somewhere only you knew, could look a great deal safer than trusting an institution that might not exist in 6 months. A pond, especially one dug or expanded during exactly that era, offers something a buried box in an open field doesn't: depth, concealment, and a natural excuse for disturbed ground that nobody would ever think twice about. This farmer did not know any of that history yet, standing on the bank with mud drying on his forearms. All he knew was that his grandfather had dug this pond sometime after buying the property, and that nobody currently alive in the family had ever heard so much as a rumor about anything being hidden on the land. That silence, it would turn out later, was not because there was nothing to tell. It was because the one person who could have told them had never told anyone at all. The family gathered around the box on a tarp spread across the tailgate of a pickup because nobody wanted mud from the box getting into the actual bed of the truck, which is exactly the kind of small, practical, slightly absurd detail that tends to show up in real accounts of moments like this. The latch, fused solid with rust, would not budge by hand, and after a few minutes of trying not to force it and risk damaging whatever was inside, the farmer's wife suggested what turned out to be the right call. Stop. Don't force anything else today, and get someone who actually knows how to open a decades-old sealed container without destroying its contents. That instinct, patience over impulse, right at the moment, curiosity was at its absolute peak, is exactly the kind of decision that separates finds that get properly documented and preserved from finds that end up as a sad story about something valuable getting scratched to pieces by an impatient crowbar. They wrap the box loosely in a plastic sheet to keep it from drying and cracking further in the open air, set it in a cool corner of the machine shed, and the farmer spent that entire evening doing something he almost never did during the work week, which was to sit at the kitchen table with his laptop, searching for who in the region actually specialized in opening and assessing exactly this kind of found object without ruining it. He found, after several calls that went nowhere, a conservator who worked with the Regional Historical Society roughly 90 minutes away, someone whose actual job involved exactly this kind of careful, unglamorous, unhurried work. She agreed to come out the following week once she'd cleared some time, and asked him to do exactly one thing in the meantime: nothing. Leave the box exactly as it was, don't scrub it, don't force it, don't let it dry out too fast, and resist every urge to satisfy his own curiosity with a hammer. That week of waiting turned out to be its own kind of story. Word travels fast in a small farming community, and by the third day, half the county seemed to know that something had come up out of that pond. The same uncle who'd bet him a case of beer showed up twice more just to look at the box sitting wrapped in the shed, and the same neighbors who joked about frog bones started asking, with noticeably less humor in their voices, whether he had any idea yet what it might actually be. He didn't. There was no dramatic countdown. There was just a family finishing their evening chores every night with a mystery sitting quietly in the corner of their machine shed, waiting for someone with the right tools and the right patience to finally open it properly. The conservator arrived on a Tuesday morning with a case of tools that looked more like something out of a dental office than a farm shed: soft brushes, small precision picks, a portable humidity gauge, and a notebook she filled in almost constantly, documenting the box's condition before she touched a single working part of it. She explained, while the family watched from a respectful distance, that the pitting pattern on the metal told her roughly how long it had likely been submerged, and that the specific style of the hinges and the remnants of the latch suggested a container manufactured sometime in the middle of the 20th century, consistent with a strong box or a small document safe rather than a piece of farm equipment. Working slowly using a penetrating lubricant and gentle, sustained pressure rather than force, she spent nearly 40 minutes freeing the corroded latch mechanism without damaging the lid around it. The family stood in a loose semicircle in the shed, nobody saying much. The only sound, the occasional soft scrape of a tool against old metal, and the distant, ordinary noise of cattle in the next pasture over, entirely uninterested in the moment unfolding a few hundred feet away. When the latch finally gave, with a small, unglamorous click that felt enormous in that quiet shed, she paused before lifting the lid, not for drama, but out of genuine professional caution. Contents that have been sealed for decades can react badly to sudden exposure to air and light, and she wanted to lift it slowly enough to see what she was dealing with before the family's understandable excitement pushed anyone to reach in too fast. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and had long since degraded into a dark, fragile crust, was a layered collection of objects that told, piece by piece, a story none of them had been expecting. There was a bundle of paper currency, brittle and water-stained, but still largely intact thanks to the oilcloth wrapping and the container's partial seal. Bills from a series of denominations no longer in common circulation. There was a small cloth pouch, heavier than its size suggested, that turned out to hold a collection of coins, some clearly silver, tarnished nearly black but unmistakably minted rather than random scrap. And tucked into a corner of the box, wrapped separately in what had once been a handkerchief, was a woman's ring, a simple gold band with a small stone, and a pocket watch, its case dented on one side, but its crystal remarkably still unbroken. The room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when everyone in it is doing math in their head and trying not to say the number out loud first. The farmer's wife was the one who eventually spoke, and what she said wasn't about money. She asked simply whose ring that was. That question, whose ring, would end up mattering a great deal more than the dollar figure anyone in that shed was privately calculating, because a ring like that isn't currency. It's a person. And figuring out who that person had been was about to become the actual heart, because the process is slower, more careful, and considerably less cinematic than the moment of discovery itself. The paper currency, even in reasonably preserved condition, requires specialist handling to determine both its face value and any collector value, since certain older series and certain printing errors can be worth significantly more to collectors than their printed denomination. The coins require the same careful assessment, since condition, mint marks, and rarity matter far more to a coin's actual value than the metal it's made from. Preliminary assessment from the conservator and a coin specialist she brought in the following week placed the currency and coin collection's combined value based on comparable documented finds of similar composition and condition. The investigation into who had actually buried that box began, as these things almost always do in rural communities, with the county courthouse. Property records for the farm went back through several ownership changes, but the deed history confirmed what the family already believed. The land had been purchased by the farmer's grandfather in the years following the Second World War, and it was his grandfather who had, according to the one surviving photograph, expanded that original shallow depression into a proper stock pond sometime in the early 1950s. And it was the County Historical Society, the same organization the conservator worked with, that turned up the answer inside an old plat map and a handwritten ledger of land transfers that had somehow survived in their archive. The property had changed hands in 1936, sold by a family that county records showed had lived on that land for at least 2 prior generations. Sold, according to a brief and fairly clinical note in the transfer paperwork, due to what the ledger described only as financial hardship. That single phrase, financial hardship in the middle of the Great Depression, on a piece of farmland changing hands in 1936, was the thread that pulled the rest of this story together. A local historian who specialized in the region's Depression-era records was able to confirm what the family had started to suspect on their own. The previous owning family had, like a great many rural landowners of that specific era, lost significant savings when a regional bank failed in the early 1930s and had spent the following several years in exactly the kind of precarious financial situation that led many families to distrust banks entirely. Rural communities across the country saw a measurable, lasting shift in how people stored their savings after the bank failures of the early 1930s are common enough in state historical society archives that several state treasurers' offices maintain informal files just to track and cross-reference exactly this category of discovery. What the historian could not immediately confirm was whose ring and whose watch had been in that box, and that turned into the more emotionally weighted half of the investigation. Working from a handful of surviving names in the old property transfer ledger, the family and the historian tracked down a distant descendant of the family that had sold the land in 1936, a woman in her 70s living 2 states away, who had grown up hearing family stories, never confirmed, never proven, about a grandmother who had supposedly hidden the family's savings somewhere in the old home place before they lost it, savings that nobody in the family had ever been able to locate or reclaim once the land was sold. The ring, based on the style of its setting and a faint, nearly worn-away engraving on its inner band that the conservator was able to partially read under magnification, appeared consistent with an engagement or wedding band from roughly the correct era, and the pocket watch, once cleaned, revealed a maker's mark that helped date it to the same general decades. None of this constituted absolute, ironclad proof of exactly whose hands these items had passed through, but the weight of circumstantial evidence, the land history, the bank failure, the family's own oral history about a hidden cache that was never found, and the physical dating of the objects themselves was strong enough that both the historian and the descendant herself felt confident the box had almost certainly belonged to her own great-grandmother, buried sometime before the family lost the land in 1936 and left behind, undiscovered, for the better part of 90 years. This is where the story stops being simply about money and becomes something closer to what actually made it worth telling in the first place. A family had lost their home during the hardest economic period in the country's modern history, had apparently tried to protect at least some part of what they had left by hiding it, and had then, for reasons nobody now alive can fully explain, either forgotten exactly where they'd hidden it, been unable to retrieve it before the property changed hands, or simply never had the chance to come back for it at all. Whatever the exact reason, that hidden cache sat in the mud at the bottom of what would become someone else's stock pond for nearly a century, quietly outliving everyone who had actually buried it. Once the historical picture started coming into focus, the practical, legal question that had been sitting quietly in the background from the very first day finally had to be dealt with directly. Who under the law actually owns something like this? Lost property is something the original owner appears to have misplaced accidentally and would presumably want back. Mislaid property is something intentionally set down somewhere and then forgotten, with no clear intent to abandon it permanently. Abandoned property is something the original owner has clearly and intentionally given up any claim to. And a treasure trove, the oldest and in many ways strangest of these categories with roots stretching back to English common law, refers specifically to money, coin, gold, or silver intentionally hidden by an owner with the apparent intent of recovering it later, where that owner is now unknown or cannot be found. Not every state in the country even recognizes treasure trove as its own distinct legal category anymore. A number of states have folded it into the broader category of mislaid or lost property, which changes the default answer of who has first claim to it. In many jurisdictions, when a treasure trove classification does apply, the general common law rule leans toward the finder having the strongest claim over the owner of the land, specifically because the whole premise of a treasure trove is that it was hidden by someone with intent to come back for it. A living descendant of the family who almost certainly hid the box in the first place had actually been located and had a reasonable, evidence-supported claim to at least a moral, if not always a strictly enforceable legal, connection to those specific personal items, the ring and the watch in particular, which are not treated under the law the same way currency and coin are, since they're identifiable heirlooms rather than fungible money. The family consulted a property attorney, and what followed was less a courtroom drama and more a careful, practical process of sorting the find into its different legal categories and dealing with each one appropriately. The currency and coin, legally classified under their state's specific treasure trove statute, and given that no other claimant beyond the landowning family itself had stepped forward with any documented legal right to it, was confirmed as belonging to the family who found it, the current landowners, following the standard process of public notice that many state treasure trove statutes require essentially a formal, documented waiting period during which any legitimate prior claimant has the opportunity to come forward. The ring and the watch, however, the family chose to handle differently, and this decision is worth sitting with because it wasn't legally required. Having identified a living descendant of the family who most likely owned those specific items, the farmer and his wife made the decision entirely voluntarily to return the ring and the watch to her, along with copies of everything the historian had uncovered about her own family's history on that land. It was not the largest financial component of the find, but by every account from everyone involved, it was the moment that mattered most. That decision did not happen overnight, and it wasn't without some genuine internal debate within the family about what was fair, what was legally required versus what felt right. In the end, the family's own account of that decision came down to something fairly simple. The money would help them regrade a pond bank and pay down some equipment debt either way, but the ring wasn't really theirs to keep once they knew whose it almost certainly was. The formal appraisal process, once the legal ownership question was settled, moved through several stages that are worth walking through plainly, because this is the part of these stories that television and viral posts almost always skip entirely. The currency went to a paper money specialist who examined each bill individually under magnification, checking for printing anomalies, series identification, and condition grading on the standard scale used across the collectibles industry. A scale that runs from heavily circulated and damaged all the way up to pristine, uncirculated condition, with value shifting dramatically at each step along that scale. The coins went through a similar, separate process with a numismatist, someone who specializes specifically in coin valuation, who identified mint years, mint marks indicating which facility had struck each coin, and condition grading using the coin industry's own separate scale. Silver content alone gave the coins a baseline value tied to the current market price of silver, but several of the coins carried collector premiums well above their raw metal value due to their specific mint year and condition, which is a distinction that trips up a lot of people encountering old coins for the first time. A coin's age alone does not determine its value. Rarity and condition in combination do almost all of the work. The ring, once returned to the family it most likely belonged to, was appraised separately by a jeweler at the descendant's own request, mostly out of simple curiosity about her own family's history rather than any intention to sell it. And the pocket watch was examined by a horologist who was able to identify the manufacturer and approximate production year with reasonable confidence, adding one more small, solid piece of evidence to the historical picture the family had already pieced together. The full appraisal process, start to finish, took several months, considerably longer than anyone in the family had initially expected. There's a persistent myth, fed by how these stories get compressed for entertainment, that a find like this gets weighed, valued, and settled within days. In reality, careful, honest, and doing it properly with full documentation at each step is exactly what protects a family from later disputes, undervaluation, or fraud. Once the appraisal was complete and the treasure trove statute's public notice period had passed without any competing claim being filed, the family had, in practical terms, a documented, legally clear windfall, along with something considerably harder to put a dollar figure on. A fully reconstructed piece of their own land's history that none of them had ever known before that pond started draining. The pond itself got finished, regraded properly, its banks reinforced well beyond what the original drainage project had even called for, since by that point there was no version of this family that was going to leave that project half done. It refilled naturally over the following winter and now sits, by all accounts, looking almost exactly like it always did from a distance, an ordinary stock pond behind a stand of cottonwoods, holding water for cattle exactly the way it was designed to nearly 70 years ago. The financial windfall, once everything was settled, went toward exactly the kind of unglamorous, practical things that tend to actually matter on a working farm, rather than anything resembling a spending spree. Equipment debt that had been hanging over the operation for years got paid down substantially. A second, long-deferred drainage and erosion project on another part of the property, one that had been pushed to next year and the year after that more times than anyone wanted to admit, finally got funded and finished. And a portion, by the family's own choice, went into a modest, direct restoration and preservation of the farmhouse itself, the same house the farmer's grandfather had lived in. When he dug that pond in the first place, a small but pointed way of honoring exactly the kind of continuity this whole discovery had ended up being about. The relationship between this family and the descendant of the original landowning family did not end with the return of the ring and watch. The two families have, by several accounts, stayed in occasional contact since exchanging what historical details each side has been able to piece together, and the descendant has spoken about finally having a physical, tangible piece of a family story that had existed until that pond drained, only as an unproven rumor passed down at holiday dinners for 3 generations. That's a kind of resolution no appraisal certificate can put a number on. And it's very often the actual emotional center of stories like this one, more than the dollar figure ever is. Locally, the story did what small town stories tend to do, which is spread fast, get exaggerated somewhat in the retelling, and then settle into the kind of local legend that gets brought up at the feed store or the diner counter for years afterward, usually with someone insisting the dollar figure was twice what it actually was. The uncle who bet a case of beer on hitting bedrock instead of anything worth looking at twice did, in fact, pay up, and by most tellings has gotten a good-natured amount of grief about it at every family gathering since. What this story leaves you with, more than any specific number or any specific object pulled out of that mud, is a genuinely open question that shows up again and again across real, documented cases exactly like this one, all across farm country. How much else is quietly sitting under the ordinary, unremarkable ground that people walk past every single day, under a pond nobody thinks twice about behind a fence line nobody's looked at closely in decades, hidden not by some elaborate treasure map, but simply by an entire generation's very human, very understandable decision in the hardest years anyone in this country has lived through to trust the ground under their own feet more than they trusted anyone else with what little they had left. That pond sat there for nearly 70 years, holding a piece of somebody's whole story, and the only reason it ever came back up into the light was a stuck calf and a farmer who finally got tired of pulling livestock out of the mud.